Hello Hood coders and welcome back. So in this course we are going to learn how to use Firebase together with Jetpack Compose, and we'll build a simple note application. So the first step is to authenticate a user and allow CRUD operations. So guys, without any further delay, let's code together and build the note application. Okay, so before we start here, you can just get the initial project inside our GitHub repository. So as you can see here, I have added several dependencies inside our build.gradle here, or you can just easily copy them and you are just good to go. So now let's get started. Okay, so the first step here is to connect our application with Firebase console. So we can easily do this inside Android Studio. When we navigate here to tools, and you can find this Firebase button here, which is going to load up the assistant, which is going to help us to connect to the console. And we have to locate here to authentication, and we want to select this authenticate using Google, and we want to connect this to Firebase. So for case here, we can just click this button here. Okay, now here the Firebase console has detected that this is going to be our nodes. So we're just going to click here continue so that we can easily create this project here. And we don't want to enable this analytics here, so we can just click create project, and this is just going to create our project. Okay, so our project is ready here. We can just click continue so that we can just add these applications here. So we can just easily connect here. Now our project is already connected, so we can just easily navigate back to Android Studio, and as you can see here, we have connected here, and we have other buttons which we can just easily add here the SDK, but I have already added these SDKs or the dependencies which we want to use them. As you can see here, we have already imported this bomb, and this is just going to select all of the Firebase compatible versions, and we can just easily use them. Now here, when we navigate inside the Firebase console, we can just come here to all products, and we want to select this authentication product here so that we can just get started. And now let's just get started here by enabling this authentication inside our application, and we can just select our providers or what we want to use for authentication purposes. And for case, we are going to select email and passwords here, and we want to enable this email and password, and we can just easily save here. And for that case here, our email and password has already been added. And for now, we want to come here inside our project, and we go to our project settings. And we have to add here the SH certificate here, which we can just easily generate inside Android Studio. And before we just generate this, we have to download this Google Service JSON so that we can add it inside our application. So for now, we are just going to download this. Okay, so now when you finish to download this, you can just navigate inside the folder where you have downloaded this, and we can just easily copy this, and we can just easily navigate inside our build project here, and we have to select here our project, and we can just paste this inside here. Okay, now we can just switch back here to our Android view, and we can just easily close this. Okay, so the next thing, we have to generate the SH certificate, and we can just easily generate this from the Gradle here. And as you can see here, we don't see where we can just easily use the sign-in report. So for this case, we can just press this button here, and we want to disable this experimental feature here, do not build Gradle tags. And we can just click here, apply, and we click OK. And we have to sync our project so for this to work. So we can just come here, and we want to sync project with Gradle files and wait for the Gradle to build. So the Gradle has finished to build here, so we can just navigate inside here Android, and we want to click the sign-in report here so that we can just easily generate here the SH certificates. Now we can just select here the SH1 certificate, so we can just copy this, and now we can just easily navigate back to our browser so that we can just start to use it. Okay, now we can just easily navigate here inside our SH certificate, and we want to add here a fingerprint, and we can just easily paste it here. And we can just click save here in order to save this SH certificate. And I think we are just good to go and start to code. Okay, now let's start to code here. So the first thing, we want to create a repository where we can just easily authenticate our user. And for this case, we can just navigate inside here our node, and we can just create a new package. and we want to call this out repository. And we want to create here a first class, so we can just create here a coding class, and we want to call this authentication repository. Okay, so inside here repository, we want to get the current user, so we can just call this current user. And this is just a normal Firebase user. And now we can just use this Firebase object here, which is just a variable in Kotlin. And we can just call auth, and we want to get the current user. And this is just going to return the current user. Okay, so we want to check if the user is going to be logged in or not. And for this case, we have to create a function that is going to help us to decide this. So we can just call this as user. And this is just going to return a Boolean. And we can just easily use the Firebase object again. And for this case here, we want to check this is not going to be equal to null. And for this case, we know that the user has been logged in. And also we want to get the user ID. So we can just call this get user ID. And this is just going to return a string. And for this case here, we can just call here firebase.auth. And also we want to get the current user. And here now we want to get the user ID. And here we can just call or empty if this is just going to be null. Okay. Now for our case here, we want to create another function that is going to create the actual user. And this is just going to be a suspend function. So we can just call this create user. And here basically we want to pass in the email. And also we want to pass in here password. And we want to have another function that is going to be the onComplete. And this is just going to return a Boolean here. Okay, so we want to switch the threads between the main thread to the IO. So we can just use a dispatcher. So we can just call here with context. And we want to use the dispatcher.io. And this is just going to change the threads. And for this case here, now we want to create the user. So we can just use the Firebase object. And here we want to select this authentication. And we want to create user with email and password. And here basically now we can just pass in the email and password. And also we want to add the onComplete listener. And for this case here, we can just check if this is going to be successfully. And now here, basically, we can just call here our onComplete. And we can invoke this with true. And else here, we can just invoke this onComplete listener with a false. So this is just going to bring us the feedback so that we can just easily create. And we know that we have created successfully the user. And for that case here, we want to call the await function. So we don't want to block the main thread. So beside this, we can just call here await. Okay, so this was just for creating a user. Now let's create another function, which is just going to help us to log in a user. So it's just going to be similar to this, but we can just easily change here to be login. And for case here, instead of create user, so we can just call here sign in with email and password. And for that case, we have already completed to create our two login and the sign out. Okay, now let's create here another package, which is just going to be for our login screens and other things. So we can just call this login. And here we can just create here a login screen. And here we want to create our login view model. And now this is just going to inherit from the view model. And here we can just create the private val. We want to get the repository. So we can just call this repository. Okay, now below this, we can just create here a data class that is going to hold up our UI state, because we could have numerous UI states. So we can just group them inside our UI, our data class. So we can just call this login UI state here. And here we want to provide variables. So the first thing here, we are just going to create a username, for example. And we can just initialize this to an empty string for the first. And here also we want to provide the password. And also we want to duplicate this for the sign up page. So we can just call this username sign up. And also here we can change this to sign up. And also we want to create here a confirm password. Okay, also we want to create here a state if this is going to be loading. So we can just call this is loading. And for this case, we can just initialize this to false. And also we can check if this is just successfully. And here we can just provide the sign up error. And also we want to create the login error. And we can just initialize this to be null for the first time. Okay, now we can just jump inside here our view model. And now we can just get our current user. So we can just call this current user. And here we can just call this repository.current user. And also we want to create another variable here, and we can just call this has user. And this is just going to return a boolean, and we can just define here a get function. And here we want to call our repository.has user. And for that case, we are just going to get the user. Okay, also here we want to create our login state. So we can just call here login UI state. And we can just create here a mutable state of. And we want to call here our login UI state. And we want to import these values here. Okay, now let's create our events which are going to modify our state. So we can just call here, and here we have to specify this to be private set. So this can be only modified inside here our view model. And also now we can just define here our events which are going to modify the UI. So we can just call here on username change. And here basically we can just provide username, which is just going to be a string. And we can just call here login UI state, and we want to reinitialize this, and we want to copy here, and we can change the username back to the username which we have provided here. And we can do the same to the rest of other items. And here we can just call on password change. And here basically now we can change the password. And here basically we can just change the sign up, and we can just pass in here the username, and here we want to change the sign up username. And also here we can just change the password. And here basically we can change the on confirm password. Okay, so these are just the events which are going to modify our state. And now we want to write our function which is going to help us to create a user. But first we want to validate these forms if they are not empty, because we don't want to authenticate a user without any fields. So we can just create here a private function, and we can just call this validate login form. So we can just call here our login UI state, and we want to get the username, and we don't want this to be is blank. And also here we can just check here, and we want to check also this is not going to be blank. Also we can just provide another function which is just going to check up the so here we're going to validate the sign up forms. So we can just call here our login UI state, and here we have to check this is not going to be blank. Okay, so here we can validate our forms. So now let's create a function that is going to help us to create the user. Okay, now let's create here a function which is just going to create a user. And here basically we can just pass in a context because we want to display a toast message. So we're just using this context here for displaying that. And for this case here, now we can just use the view model scope. And we can just launch this. Okay, now we can just use here a try catch block here. So we want first to throw errors if our forms are going to be invalid. So we can just check here if this form is, we want to validate these forms. So we can just validate the forms. And if this is just going to be true here, so we are just negating this value, and we want to throw an illegal argument exception. And here we can just say email and password. And here we can just provide the catch. Okay, now we want to make here our function is going to be loading. So we can just call here our login UI. And also we want to check here if the confirmation passwords are not equal. So we can just check here if the sign up password. So we can just use here our login UI state. So when this is not going to be equal, so we can just throw another illegal argument exception. And here basically we can just say password do not match. And if we have passed this, we can just use our login UI state, and we can just copy here. And we want to turn this back to null. So we are going to start again. So these errors have been passed. Okay, now we can just call here our repository. And we want to create the user. And here we have to pass in the email and password. And we can just call here our login UI state. And we want to pass in here the sign up name. And here we want to pass in the sign up password. And here we want to check if this is going to be successfully or not. And if this is just going to be successfully, we can just easily toast here message. So we can just check if this is successfully. And here we can just pass in the context. Okay, so if this is just successfully, also we want to provide the state. So we can just call here login UI state. And here basically we want to pass in that successfully login. And here we want to make it to be true. And else here we can just create another toast message, or we can just copy this. And here we can just call it fail. And for that case also we can just change here our UI state. And we want to make is success login back to false. Okay, now let's deal here with our exceptions. And for case here, if we get any exception, we can just call here our login UI state. And we want to pass in here the error. So we can just call here copy and call the sign up error. And here we can just get the exception.localized message, which is just going to give us the error. And also we can just call here e.print struct trace so that we can just get this to our logcat. And for that case here, we can just call here finally. And for this case here, we can just call here login UI state. And here basically we want to disable the loading progress bar. So we can just call here login UI state.copy. And here basically we can just change is loading back to false. Okay, so I think here this is just our function which is going to help us to create a user. So we can just easily copy this. And we want to duplicate this again. And instead here of creating a user, we're just going to call this login. And here basically we can just remove this validation here because we're just going to use this single validation here. And here we want to call validate forms. So we want to check if the login forms are empty, then we have to throw this illegal argument exception. And for this case here, we can just pass in here the sign in error. And instead here of create user, so we can just call here login. And basically here also we want to change, we want to use the username. And also here we want to use the password. And also we are just going to leave this everything as is because we know that. And instead here we can just change this sign up error here to be a login error. And here we can just easily leave everything as they are. Okay, so I think here our view model is complete. Now let's navigate inside here our login screen so that we can just start to create our login screen. So let's create here a new composable and we're just going to call this login screen. Okay, now let's create here several parameters. So we have the login view model and we're just going to make this nullable, and because we want to use a preview function, so we are just going to pass this to be null. And here we want to provide the on navigations. So we want to call this on navigate to homepage. And this is just going to return nothing. And also here we want to navigate to the login page. So for example, here we want to navigate to the sign up page. Okay, now let's create here an instance of login UI. And here basically we can just call here our login view model. And we can just easily get our UI state here. And also we want to check if there is an error. So we can just call this is error. And now we can just use here our login UI state. And we want to get this is not going to be equal to null. So we know that this is just going to be an error. And also we want to get the context. So we can just call here context. Okay, now let's create here a column. And here basically we are going to pass in a modifier. And we want to fill the max size. And here we can just pass in the horizontal alignment. And we want to center everything horizontally. Okay, now let's create here our first item. We are going to create here a text. And we are just going to call this login. And here we want to provide a style. And we can just use here a material theme. And we want to use header 3. And also here we want to provide the font weight. And we want to make this black. And also we want to change the color, so we can just make this material theme. And we want to use the primary color. Okay, so the next thing here, we want to check if there is any error so that we can just display it here to the user. So we can just check here if is error. And basically now we can just show the user that we have an error. So we can just create here a text. And for this case here, we can just use our login UI state. And we want to check for login error. And if this is going to be null, so we want to call this unknown error. And here we can just change the color. This we can make the color red. Okay, also here we can just create a preview function. And we can just call this prev login screen. And here basically we want to show the system UI, so we can just call here show system UI, and we can make this to be true. And here we can just call the not theme application, so the not theme function here, and basically we can just call here our login screen. Okay, so this is just our preview here. Now let's continue to add other items. Okay, now let's create here an outline text field, and here we want to pass in the values, so we can just use our login UI state. And we want to select the username, and if this is just going to be null, so we are just going to pass in here an empty string. And here on value change, so we can just use here our login view model. And here we want to call the on username change. And basically we can just pass in here it, so that it can just reflect that. Also here we can just easily pass in a modifier. And we want to provide here a padding of 16 dp. And also we want to fill the max width. Okay, so let's provide here a leading icon. So this is just the icon before the text field. And here basically now we can just provide the icon. And we can just use the icons here. And here we can just provide this person here. And basically here we are going to pass in to be null. Okay, also here we want to pass in a label, so we can just call here label. And here, for example, we can just call this to be email. And we want to make this text field to show an error if there is an error. So we can just call here is error. So this is just going to automatically change the color of the text fields. Okay, now let's create here a password, and we can just easily duplicate this. And instead here of username, we can just easily pass in here password, and here we can just call on password change. And here we can basically use the log here to show the icon, and here we can just change to be password. And also here we can add one item, which is just called here the visual transformation, which is just going to transform this to hide the password which is entered. So we can just call here password visual transformation. Okay, now let's preview the changes we have made. Okay, so I think everything is looking good. Now let's finish up to add other items. Okay, now let's create here a button which is going to help us to submit these forms. And here inside the on click, so we can just create here a text first. And we can just call this sign in. And we can use here a login view model, and we want to log in the user. So we can just call here login user. And here we want to provide the context, which is just we have created above there. Okay, now let's create here a spacer. And here we want to create a space of 16 dp. So we want to create also the text here, which are going to ask the user if they don't have an account so that they can sign up. So we can just create here a row, and here we can just pass in here a modifier. And we want to fill the max width. And here we want to pass in the horizontal arrangement. And we want to arrange this to the center here. Okay, now here we want to provide the first text. So we can just provide here our text. And also we can just create here a spacer of 8 dp. And also here we can just create a text button. And here we want to and we can just call this sign up. And here we want to invoke our navigation. So we can just call here on nav to sign up page. And we can just invoke here if the user clicks this button here. Okay, now let's preview our changes we have made. Okay, so far so good. So I think everything is looking good. Now we want to display here the progress bar if this is going to be loading. So we can just easily navigate here and create an if statement. So we can just check here. If our login UI state is loading, and this is just going to be equal to true, then we have to show the circular progress bar. So we can just call here circular progress indicator. And for this case here, we are just going to get this loading or spinning animation. And also here we want to create a launched effect. So when the user is successfully launched in, we want to navigate to the home page. And for this case here, we can just use here a login view model. And we want to check if has user. And we are using here a launched effect because this is just a side effect. This has user here is going to arise from Firebase and not Jetpack Compose. And for this case here, we could have multiple changes and the state could be out of sync. So when we are calling here launch the effect, is going to smooth everything and launch this whenever this has changed, has user is actually changed. And then we can just run this block of code here. And now we can just check here if login view model. And we want to call this has user and is actually true. And if this is the case, then we want to navigate to the home page. So we can just call here on navigate to home page, and we can just invoke this function. And for that case, when the user is successfully logged in, then we can just actually navigate to the home page. Okay, now I think here we have finished to create our login screen. Now let's create here our sign up page, and we can just easily duplicate this, and we can just modify this same screen here in order to match our sign up screen. And instead of login screen here, we can just call this okay. Now we can just easily change here a login error, so we don't want this. And first and foremost here, we want to navigate to the sign in page here. So for example, here we can just change. We have to navigate here to the login page instead of the sign up page. And also here, the login error, we have to change this to sign up page or sign up error, and everything will leave them as they are. Okay, so also here we have to change this to be sign up. And here we want to also change this login error, and we have to change this to sign up error, and then everything is okay. And now let's navigate here inside our outline text fields here. And instead of using here the username, so we can just use the username sign up. And here on username change, we can just use on username change. And we want to use the sign up thing here, and everything is okay. And also we can just easily navigate here inside our password. And here we want to change here password sign up. And here pass on password sign up change. And also we want to duplicate this because we want to provide that confirmation of password. And here we can just change here password confirmation. And here we can just change this to confirm password. And here inside the button, instead of logging the user, we want here to create the user. So we can just call here create user, and also we have to pass in here the context. And we can just navigate here instead of on navigate to sign up page. We can use here the on navigate to login page, and we have to invoke. And here we can just change here. And we can just ask if the user already has an account, then we can just use this to navigate to the sign up page. So I think here our sign in page is ready. So we can just call this sign in instead of sign up. Now let's create another preview function here. So we can just duplicate again this, and here we can just call this preview sign up screen, and we can just easily call here our sign up screen. And now let's preview the changes we have made. Okay, so far so good. So everything is looking good. As you can see here, we have all of our screens ready to use. So now what has remained here is to create a mechanism for navigations and also finishing up the home screen. So we can just create here another package. And we want to call this home. Okay, now let's create here a new coding class or file. And here we want to create a home page. And for now here we can just create a new composable, and we are just going to call this home. And for now we are just going to display a text because we are just going to navigate here. And later here we are going to build up the home screen here. And this we can just call this. Okay, now let's create here a new coding class or file. And now we want to call this navigation. Okay, so now we want to navigate here, and the first thing here we want to create the routes, and we can use an enum class here, and we want to create the login routes. And here we are going to have the sign up page and the sign in page. And also here we can create another enum class, and here we are just going to have the home routes. And here we have our home page, and also we are going to have a detail screen. And I think basically there we are just good to go. Okay, so here we have to pass in several parameters, and the first one is just the nav controller. And here we can just call remember nav controller. And also we want to get the login view model, which is just going to come from the main activity. And for that case here, we can just create our nav host. And here we want to create our starting route. This is just our start destination here, and we can just using the login view model, login routes, and we want to select the sign in page. And here basically now we can just create our composable. Okay, now we want to specify here the route. And basically here we can just use the login routes. And here basically now we can just call our composable. So we want to call in here the login screen. And here we want to navigate to the home page. So we can just call here of controller. And here basically now we can just use the home routes. And we want to pop up to, and we want basically to pop up to this route here. So we can just provide here our route, and we want to call the login screen, login routes. So we want to remove this from the back stack here, and we can just call this inclusive and make it to be true. And for this case, when we navigate to the home page, when we click the back button, we are going to quit the application and not going back to our sign in page or sign up page. And for that case, we are just going to use this mechanism here. Okay, so here we want to navigate to our sign up page. So we can just call here nav controller, and we want to navigate. And here we can just call our login routes. And here we can just call here our pop-up, and we want to call here login routes. And also we can just make this to be inclusive and make it to be true. And also here we want to call launch single top. And we want to make this to be true. So that is just going to create one instance of this inside our back stack and not multiple instances. So we can just make also this to be true. And for that case, we have only one item and not multiple items of the same screen inside our application. Okay, now let's create here another composable. And here we want to create our sign up route. So we can just call this route and call here login routes. And also here we can just call here our sign up screen. And here basically now we want to navigate, so we can just call here our nav controller. And here we want to call home route, and we want to navigate to the home. And also here we want to use this inclusive here. Okay, and also here we can just deal with this on navigate to homepage, and this is just where we're supposed to call this. And here is just the navigation back to the sign in page. So we can just call here the nav controller. And basically here now we can just call our login routes. And for that case, also we can just define here another composable, which is just going to be for our home screen. So we can just call here route. And here we want to use home routes. And basically here now we can just call here our home screen. And we don't have anything to navigate to when we get inside our home screen. Okay, now let's navigate here inside our main activity. And inside here now we want to create a variable for our view model. Now we can just call this login view model. And we can use a view model function here. And we want to provide the model class, which is just going to be our login view model. And now here we can just call our navigation. And basically here now we can just pass in our login view model. Okay, now let's test our application. And before we run here, we call the sign in report. So we can just change this back to our application, and let's launch this inside our app. Okay guys, so when we launch our application, we are just getting this error here. So the default Firebase app is not initialized. So I think we have forgotten to add this inside our build.credo projects. So we can just navigate here, and here we want to apply this plugin here. So we want to add this com.google.gms Google services in order to make it to sync properly. And also we have to navigate inside here our build.credo file. Also here we have to add this dependency here, com.google.gms Google services 4310. And now let's try to sync the project and see the changes we have made. Now our build.credo file has finished to sync. Now let's try to run our application again and see the changes. So our application has launched successfully. However, when we try to type inside this text fields here, nothing happens. And this is because we have forgotten to use this view model here. So we can just pass in inside here our view model. And also inside here, the sign up page, also we can just pass in here a view model. And now let's try to rerun again the application and see the changes. Okay, now our application has launched successfully. So here, for example, if we try to sign in without anything, as you can see here, we're getting an error. Now let's jump inside here, our sign up page here. So for example, here we can just create a new email. So for example, here ABD, and we can try to pass in here password 123456. And here also we can try 123456 7. And then when we try here, we are just getting here password do not match error. So when we remove this and try again, so we are going to sign in here, and we navigate to the home screen successfully. Okay, now let's navigate inside here our repository. And for our case here, now we can create here a new coding class or file. And for now here, we want to create a storage repository. So we can just call this storage. Okay, so now before we start to create our storage repository, we have to navigate inside here our Cloud's Firestore. So we are going just directly here inside our console, and then we can just easily navigate here. So if you don't see this Firestore database shortcut, you can just come here inside the all products, and then you can just look for Cloud Firestore and then select it. And for that case here, we have to create our database. So you can just click this, and there are two options to start in production mode and in test mode. So for case we want to start in test mode and click next, then we have to enable this. Okay, now our database has been set up and we have this page here. As you can see here, we can just easily create a new collection. So we're just going to come back here in just a moment. So as you can see here, we have several tabs here inside our Cloud Firestore. So we have here a tab of rules, and this is just defining the rules, which is going to help us to restrict the reading and writing of our document. So we can just restrict, for example, a user is not authenticated, so we don't want them to write or read from our application. But for our case, we are just doing this for demonstration purposes, so we are just going to allow read and write. So if you're writing for production mode, you have to write robust rules, and it's just out of scope of this video. And as you can see here, also we have another tab which is just indexes, and this is just creating compound queries. So for example, if you want to filter or do other things, you have to write a compound queries which contains multiple fields. So for our case here, we are just going to see this in a little bit because we are going to write a compound query. And also here you have a tab of usage, and this is just going to indicate how much have you used the Cloud Firestore data. And now let's come back here inside our data tab. Okay, now the first thing inside here Cloud Firestore is just to create a collection. So you can just picture this as a folder that contains a bunch of documents. And for example, here now we can just create a collection, and this is just a must when you want to create, you want to store data inside Firestore, and we have to provide an ID and then provide its first document. So for our case here, we can just call this notes and click next here. And what we want to create here, a first document. So for example, we're just going to auto generate this, and this is just going to be auto generated even when we write it inside our code. And we have to provide the first field. So for our case, we are just going to dismiss this and click save here, and it's going to save this new document. As you can see here now, this collection here contains one document, and this document also we can just add fields and other things. So this is just one note. So for example, if we want to add another note here, we can just click here, add another document, and we can auto generate here another field, and we can just easily save. And as you can see here, so this is just going to be the list of all our notes, and you can just create another sub collection inside a document. So for example, inside here our document, we can start another collection, and this can be a collection. For example, inside our note we have images, so we can just create another collection which is just going to have a bunch of images. So for example, here we have a URL to our image, or a URI where the image is going to be saved. And for this case, we have a bunch of characters, and we have to auto generate here, and we can just easily save. And as you can see here, now we have the notes, then we have the document, and we have another collection which is just containing another images, and this could contain another document here, for example. So we have multiple images inside these images sub collections, and this is just contained inside a document here. And as you can see here, now we have these documents, and inside here a document we can just easily add fields. So for example, here we can add a field, for example an ID, and there are multiple data types here. And when you click this drop down menu here, you can see we have numbers, boolean, map, array, null, timestamp, and geopoint. So whenever you want this, so for example here we want to select number, we can just provide this to be a certain number, and we can just easily add it here. So this is just how you can easily add and delete documents inside a Cloud Firestore. So for example, here we want to delete, and we can just easily delete a collection, and we want to delete the notes collection. So we can just easily click here, and we are just going to delete our collection. So however, we want only a single collection here, which we are going to solve this inside our code. So we can just click next here again and auto generate this, and we can just save this document here for the first time. So let's see how we can just easily add and remove documents, and perform CRUD operation using our application. Okay, now let's create here a constant val, and here we want to get the reference to our collection. So, and our collection is just, we can just call this notes collection ref. And basically here we can just provide notes, and this is just the name of our collection which we have provided inside our console here. And for that case, now let's create here our class. So we can just create here class storage repository. Okay, so inside here our storage repository, first we want to get the user, so we can just call here user, and we want to call Firebase, and we want to get the current user. And also here we want to create another function which is just going to look for users if it's going to be logged in. So we call this has user, and this is just going to return a boolean. And we want to check this is not going to be equal to null. Okay, now here we want to get the user ID, and this is going to return a string. And here now we can just call here our authentication, and here we get our user ID. And we're going to pass empty if this user ID is going to be null. Okay, so we want to obtain the nodes reference, and this is just going to obtain the collection reference. So we can just create here a private variable, and we are just going to call those nodes ref. And this is just going to be a collection reference. And we can easily obtain this by using our Firebase object, and we can just call here our Firestore. And here we have to call this collection here in order to get the nodes reference. And here we have to pass in the collection reference name, and here is just our nodes collection reference, which we have defined inside our console. Okay, so we want to retrieve the data from Firestore. So the first thing here, we are just going to create a resource class that is going to help us to manage the state of getting this data. So we can just create here a sealed class, and we are just going to call this resource. And this is just going to be a generic type. And also here we want to provide a data type. And we can just initialize this to be null. And also here we have to provide a throwable, which is just going to be the error. So we can just call here throwable. Okay, now here we have to create a class, and this is just going to be a loading class. And also we provide here type T, and this is going to inherit from the resource class. And here we're just passing nothing, because here our throwable, and also this we can just make it to be null. Okay, we provide another class here, and this is just a success class. And here inside our success, we have to provide the data, and also we have another class, which is just the error class. Okay, so this is just our resource class, which is going to help us to manage the state of getting our data. Now let's navigate here and create our function, which is going to get us data from Firebase. Okay, so before we start fetching our data, we have to create a model of our node, which we want to save and retrieve. So we can just navigate inside here, our nodes package, and create another package. And this one is, we are going to call it model. And inside our model class here, we can just create a new Kotlin class or file. And here we want to call this, and we want this to be a data class. Okay, now here we can just create our user ID, and we can just initialize this to an empty string, and also create here a title. And here we can just create the description or the actual notes here, and also it's dot string here, and we can just pass in an empty string. And also we want to get the timestamp, and we can use this Google Firebase timestamp, and we can just use timestamp.now so that it can get the actual time. And also here we want to save the color, and we can actually save it as an integer, so we can just call this color index and save it to be 0. And also we want to get the document ID or the note ID, and here we are just going to save it as a string, and also we can just initialize this to an empty string. And for that case, here we have our notes application. Now let's jump inside here and create our first. Okay, now let's create here our function, and we want to call this get user notes. So this is just going to fetch all of the user nodes. So here we can just pass in a user ID, and we want this to return a flow so that we can be watching for data changes. And here basically we want to return a resource, and we can pass in a list of nodes. And we are going to use a feature of Kotlin, which is just called a callback flow. So this one can help us to execute or emit values inside a callback. So we are just using this callback flow, and we can just opt in this. The features are experimental in the version of the Kotlin I'm using, but the newer version of Kotlin, this is no longer experimental. Okay, now let's create here a snapshot listener. So we can just call this a snapshot listener. And here, this is just going to be a listener registration. And we can just initialize this to be null. Okay, now let's create here a try catch block. Okay, so we have to initialize here a snapshot listener. And what we want to do is to create a query that is going to be sent to the Firebase server and return us a data. So we have to formulate this query in the order which we want. So we can just create here the note reference. And the first thing which we want is to just filter this data. So we want to arrange this in a certain order. So we want to order by a timestamp. So we can just call here timestamp. And here we have a query direction. As you can see here, another parameter is the query direction. So for example, here, if you write query the direction, and you can easily create this in ascending or descending order. So for case, we're just going to leave the default one, which is just going to suffice our need. And also we are going to add another query filter parameter, which we want to use this where equal to. So this one is going to limit to these fields only. And for our case here, we want to use the user ID. So we don't want to return this data if they is not the user created them. So we are going to provide here the user ID. And for that case here, we can just call here add a snapshot listener. And here we can just rename it. So we have the snapshot. And also it's going to give us an error if there is any error which has occurred. So as you have seen here, you can just limit this from the client side and from the server side. So if you want to use rules to restrict this, so you can just easily use the rules. So for simplicity, we are just going to limit this from the client side. Okay, now let's create here a response. So we are just going to get the response from the snapshot. So we can just call this response. And here we want to use an if statement. We want to check if this snapshot is not going to be equal to null. And for this case, we know we have retrieved the result. So what we want to do is to get the nodes. So we can just call here nodes. And we want to convert this because this is not going to be known by our files. So we want to transform them to get them to our nodes file. So we can just call here a snapshot and call to object. So this one is going to transform back to our nodes class. Okay, so this is going to deserialize the data which is going to be returned, so it will be in form of JSON format. So we don't understand this, so we are going to use this to object here in order to deserialize the data which has been returned, and it must conform to this style here. And for that case here we have our not, and we want to emit now our success, so we can just call here our resource, and we have to provide our data. So the data is going to be our nodes, and else here we know we have not got the data, so there is an error. So for that case here we have to create another resource, and here we have to provide an error. And for our case here, so the throwable, we can just use here the e.cause, which is going to be provided by our snapshot listener. And for that case here, we can just try to send this result. So this is just the good thing about callback flow. So we can just easily emit data from the callback. And here we can just try to send. And what we want to send here is just our response. And for that case here, we want to, if there is any error when we are executing this piece of code here, we're going to catch it inside here instead of letting our application crash. So we can just try send here, and we can just call here our resource, and we can call here e.cause, and we can just print the struct trace here in order to manage this. And also here, this must close the, we have to close this callback. So we can just call here await closure. And inside here now we can just deregister everything which we have registered. So for example here, our snapshot state listener. So we can just call here snapshot state listener, and we want to remove the listener. And for that case, we have removed our data. Okay, so that was our first way of getting data, and here we have got our user nodes. So we want also to define another function which is going to get a single node. So for example, when we navigate to a detail screen, we want to fetch only a single node. So we can just create here another function, and we can just call this get node. And here we are just going to define the node ID, which is going to be of type string. And instead here we are just going to define the callback inside here, and then we can easily react to the client or the user of this function here. And now we can just create here the on error. So this is just going to return a throwable, and we can create here another which is just going to be the on success, and here it's going to return nodes. Okay, now let's obtain the nodes reference again. So here we have our collection reference, and what we want to do here is to get the document. And here we can just easily use the document, and we have to provide a path. And this is just going to be the ID which we have generated. So as you can see here, this ID here is going to be generated. So we want to obtain this ID here and pass it inside our function. And for that case here, we can just pass in the node ID. And for that case, we have obtained the ID. So we want to get this node, and we can just call here get, and this is going to help us to retrieve that document. And we can add here on success, and we can add here the on success listener. And here we can just call here our on success method here and invoke it, and we pass it with the object. So what we want to do is to obtain this document snapshot, and we have to deserialize it to what can be understood by our application. So we can just call here to object, and we want to provide here the nodes. And we have to make this nullable for this to work because it can be null. And for that case also we have to add the on error. on failure. So we are going to add here the on failure listener. And for this case here, we want to obtain the result. So we can just call here result. And we can just call here the result.cause. And we have everything. So here we have got our node. Okay, now let's create here another function. And this is just going to be add node. And here we're just going to define several parameters. As you can see here, we are defining the user ID, the title, description, timestamp, color, and the onComplete here, which is going to be invoked when we add the node successfully. And for that case here, now we can just create our data. Okay, so the first thing we want to generate the document ID, which we can just easily use the Firebase, and we can just call here document ID. And we use our nodes reference. We can create here a document and we want to get the ID of this document, which is generated automatically for us. And also here we can just create our nodes. And here we can just provide our timestamp, and also we want to define the color. So here we have our node and we have already defined everything which we want: the user ID, the title, description, timestamp, and the color. And also we have to define the document ID, which is just the document ID which we have generated here. Okay, now we can just use the nodes reference again. And for this time we want to call document. And basically we have generated the document ID, so we can just call here document ID. And what we want to do is to set this document. So this set function here is going to add the data. If there is already an object or an existing document, it's going to overwrite with this data. And for this case here, we can just call here nodes, which we have defined there. And for that case, we can just add the onComplete listener. And here basically we can just call this result. And now we can just call here an onComplete listener.invoke. And we can just call here our result.is successfully. So this one is going to tell us if our object is successfully completed. So we can just easily invoke this function here. Okay, now let's create here another function which is going to help us to delete the node. Okay, now let's create here a function which is going to help us to delete node. So we can just call this delete node. And here basically we are just going to pass in the node ID. And here we can just pass in the onComplete function, which is going to be executed when we finish up to. Okay, now we can just call here our nodes reference. And here we basically pass in the node ID. So we are going to grab the ID of this document. And for this case here, we want to delete. So we can just call this delete function here. And we want to call the onComplete listener. And for case here, we can just call here our onComplete. And we can just pass in it.is successfully. And for this case here, we have completed to delete our object. Now let's create here another function which is going to help us to update the node. Okay, so before we update here our node, we have to add another parameters which we are going to update them. So here we have obtained the node ID. So we can just define here another parameter. So for example, the title, also the actual node. We can just define here the color. And also here we have the onResult. So we can just and this one's just going to take up a boolean and return a unit. So here we can just easily update our node. So in order to update a node here, so for example, you can just create here a nodes reference. And we have to obtain the document. So we can just pass in here the node ID. and we want to update the document, so we can just call this update here. So inside here we have to define the field value pairs. So for example here, if we want to update here the not ID, and we can just easily update this not ID by using this. So if you have so many values, you cannot just define this in a certain way, because this is going to be tiresome. So what you can just do here is create a hash map. So we can just call this update data, and we can just call this hash map of. And basically here we want to create a hash map of string and any. So here we have to define the key value pairs. So we can just define here, for example, color, and we can just easily call this 2, which we have defined there. And also here we have a description. And here we have to define a title. And for this case here, we can just pass in the update data. And we can add here the onComplete listener, and we can do the same on result here. And we can just execute here our function and call it it.successfully. Okay, so this is supposed to be a string. So this is just a way which you can easily update a data using Firebase Firestore. So you define here key value pairs, and then you define the object, and then you can just easily use these not references and obtain the document and update the data. So these are just all of the methods which are going to help us to perform our CRUD operations. So now we can just deal with the view model and finish up our application. Okay, so now let's create here a new package, and we are going to create here a detail screen. So we can call this detail. And inside here, we're going to create a new coding class or file. And here we're just going to create our detail view model. Also, we can create another coding class or file. And here we're just going to create our detail screen. Okay, now let's start with our detail view model. Okay, now let's create here a constructor, and we want to obtain the value of our repository. So we can create here private val, and we want to obtain our repository. And here we can obtain the storage repository. Okay, also we want to create our data class for the UI. So we can create here data class, and we can call this detail UI state. And here we can create a lot of variables. So we can create here, for example, our color index. And we can initialize this to 0. We can create here a title. We can define here a note. Now we can define the statuses of the note. So for example, if the note is added, and by default we can make this to be false. And also we can define the selected note. And by default we can make this to be null. And here we can define our detail UI state. And let's import these values here. And this must be a var, not a val. Okay, now let's set the event to update our state. And the first thing here we can define on color change. Now we can obtain our detail UI state again, and we want to copy this and change the color index to the color index provided. And here we can obtain the on title change. Also, we can use our detail UI state and modify the state again. And also here we have to make this private set. And here we can change this to on not change. Okay, so now we want to define a function that is going to help us to add a node to our Firebase. So first we have to provide here several variables that are going to help us to perform this action. Now the first thing here, we want to create a private variable, and we can call this as user. And this is just going to be a Boolean value. Now let's define here a get function, and we want to get we can use the repository and ask if there is a user. And for this case here, we can check if the user has been logged in or not, so that we can restrict the sending of data. Okay, now also we have to obtain the user, so we can create another private variable and call this user. And this is just going to be a Firebase user and can be nullable. Now also let's define here a get function. We can call our repository and we want to get the user. Okay, so now let's define here our function. Okay, now let's create here a function and we can call this add node. And let's check if has user. So we know that the user is logged in. Now we want to allow the adding of the data. So we can call here our repository and call add node. And we can pass in here the user ID. So we want to pass this user.id. And to solve this, we want to throw an exception if the user ID is going to be null. And here we can pass in the title. And we can use our detail UI state and obtain the title. And we can pass in here the description. And we can use our detail UI state again. And we have to pass in the node. And the timestamp is going to be defined. Also, we want to define here color. And we can call here our detail UI state. And we have to pass in the color index. And now we want to define here the timestamp, and we can use timestamp.now. And here we have a callback, which is going to give us the data. And here now we can modify our UI state. So we can call here our detail UI state. And we have to pass in here the not added status, and we can just easily pass using this it. So this is just how we can easily add data to our Firebase Firestore. Okay, so we want also, when we open up our detail screen, when we want to edit a note, so we want to create a function that is going to set up the fields. So we can call this set edit. And here basically we want to obtain a note. So here we can call our detail UI state. And we can change here the color index. We can obtain here our node color index. And here we can easily pass the description. Okay, now let's define here another function that is going to fetch us a single document. So we can create here a function and we want to call this get note. And here we can specify a note ID. Okay, now here we can use our repository and we want to get our note. And here we can just pass in our note ID. And here basically we can pass in the on error. Okay, now here let's define our note ID. So we can just change our UI state. So we can call our detail UI state. And we can deal with this selected note. And here we can change to be our note. And also here when we fetch this note, we want to reassign it to our set edit fields. So we can call here our detail UI state. And this could be nullable, so we have to wrap it with this it. Okay, now here we want also to define a function that is going to help us to update our data. So we can create here a function and we can call this update note. And here basically we want to obtain the note ID. And for that case here now we can use our repository. And we want now to update note. And here now we can start to set our fields. So for example here title, we can call our detail UI state title. And here in our note we can just call our detail UI state. And here we have to pass in our note ID. And also here we have to pass in the color index. And here also we have the result. So we can just reset our detail UI state. And here we can set our update note status and we can just pass in to be it here. Okay, so we want here a function that is going to reset the update note statuses back to their normal state. So we can just create here a function and we can just call this reset not added status. And here we can just call here our detail UI state. And here we can reset our not added status back to false. And also our updated note back to false. And also we want to have a function that is going to reset the whole state back to its normal. So we can call this reset state. And here we can call our detail UI state. And we can just create here a new UI state. And for that case, we are going to reset the whole state. Okay, so now let's deal with our detail screen here. So before we create this detail screen here, we can create a new coding class. And we want to create a util class that is going to obtain our colors. So here I'm going to paste a bunch of objects, which are just going to be a list of colors, which we are going to use them inside our detail screen. Okay, now let's create here a new composable and we can call this detail screen. Okay, now here we want to define several parameters. So here we have our detail view model and this can be nullable. And also here we want to obtain the note ID. And also we want to obtain the on navigate. Okay, now let's obtain here our detail UI state. So we can call here detail UI state, and we can use our detail view model, and we want to obtain our detail UI state. And if this is nullable, we want to return an empty detail UI state. Okay, now here we want also to check if the forms are going to be empty or not. So we can just create here a variable, and we can call is forms. Also, we want to obtain the selected color. If we are just going to navigate here, so we can just select this selected color. And here we can provide an animation to change between color. And here we can use our detail UI state, and we want to select our color index. And if not, that is going to be the default color, which is just going to be the color at first. Okay, now also let's obtain here the node ID and check if the node ID is going to be blank. And we can check here on node ID that is not blank. And for this case, if the node ID is blank, we know that we are going to add a new text field, a new node. And if not, then we are going to update an existing node. And for that case, we can just easily use this. So we can change here our icon. So we can create here an icon, and we can check if and if not, here we can change another icon. Okay, so we want also to fetch the node. If the node is not going to be there, then we are not going to fetch the node. So we can create here a launch the effect. And for the case here, we can just pass in unit because we want to execute this block of code only once. And for that case, we can check if this node is going to be, the node ID is not going to be blank, then we are going to fetch a node from Firestore. So we can call here our detail view model, and we want to get a node, and we can pass in here the node ID. And if this is not the case, then we want to reset our state. So we can just call here our detail view model, and we can call here reset state, because there could be the data inside our view model and they are not cleared. So we want to reset the state to go back to our normal state. Okay, also here we want to define a scope that we are going to be launching our coroutine. So we can call this scope. Okay, also we want to obtain a scaffold state. So we can call this scaffold state. And here we can call remember scaffold state. So the scaffold state here is going to help us to show the toast or showing the snack bar. So here we can just create our scaffold. And the first thing here, we can pass in the scaffold state. Okay, now here we can also add a floating action button. And inside here, we can provide an icon. And here, basically, we can just define the icon which we have provided there. So if this is going to be updating, then we can change the icon. And also here, we can just react to our on click. So we know that the ID is there, so we want to update. So we can call here our detail view model, and we want to update. And basically here we can just pass in the node ID. And if this is not the case, then we know that we are going to add a new node. So we can call here our detail view model, and we want to add a node. And this is just going to add a new node. Okay, so here we can rename these padding values. Okay, now here we're going to create a column, and we want to pass in here a modifier. Here we can specify a background so that we can show a user when the color is going to change. So here we can set the color and the color which we have selected there. So we're going to call this selected color, and this selected color has animation. So there is going to be an animation between changing colors. And also here we can just add padding and pass in the padding values which we obtain from our lazy. Okay, so when we add a note or update a note, we want to notify the user that the note was added or was updated successfully. So we can do this by using the snack bar. So inside here, we can just create an if statement, and we want to call here our detail UI state, and we check the not added status. If the note was added successfully, now we can just use our scope, and we want to run check cumulative scope here. And for now, we can just call here our scaffold state, and we want to call here show snack bar. Okay, so when we show this snack bar, we want to reset our state, so we can call here our detail view model, and we have to reset our state, and we want to invoke our navigation, so we can call here our onNavigate.invoke. So when we finish to add this, we want also to navigate back to our home screen. And for that case, we are just going to navigate here. Also here we have to define when we update our note, we want to show another snack bar. And for this case here, we can just call scope.launch again. And we can just use here our scaffold state, and we want to use the snack bar. And also we want to use this again here to reset our state and also to navigate back to our home screen. Okay, so all of that out of our way. So now we want to add this data here. So as you can see here, we have a place where we can easily pick colors. So we can just easily add this by using a lazy low, because we could have multiple numerous colors. So we can just easily do this here. And here we can just pass in a modifier, and we want to pass in to fill max width. And here we want to space them evenly, so across the space. And also we want to pass in the content padding. And we can use the padding values. And here vertically, we want this to be spaced by 16 dp. And also here horizontally, we want this to be spaced by 8 dp. Okay, so we want to display here our item. Before we do this, we have to create a color item, which is going to obtain our object. So now we can just come below this and create a new composable function. And we can just call this color item. Okay, so here we are going to obtain our color. And we want to have the on click. Okay, so here we are going to create a surface. And basically here we can just pass in the color. And we want this to be a circular shaped. And we can just easily pass in here the modifier. And we can make a padding of 8 dp. And we can specify the size of this. We want them to be 36 dp. And we can just make this clickable. And we can just invoke the on click here. Also, we can just easily pass in here border. And we can use border stroke. And we want to pass in here 2 dp to be the width. And also we want to make the color to be black, so that we can identify all colors. Okay, so this is just our color item. Now we can just navigate back here inside our lazy list. Okay, now let's create here an items index. So this one is going to obtain the item and also give us the index. So we can just create here utils.colors. And now here we have to rename this, so we can just call this color index. And also here we have our color. Okay, now we can just call here our color item. And we have to pass in here our color. And inside here now we want to invoke our own color change. So we can call here detail view model on color change, and then we pass in here the color index, which is going to be saved inside our state. Okay, so now let's create here our edit text, which is going to show us the place where we can add our title. So we can create here an outline text field. And here on the value side, we can use our detail UI state, and we want to pass in here to be our title. And here now we can use our detail view model. And we want to call the on title change and passing it here in order to modify our state. And here we can just basically pass in a label, and we can just use here a text. And let's pass in here a modifier. And we want to fill the max width. And also we can provide here a padding of 8 dp. Okay, so now let's create here our not edit text field. So we can just create here our outline text field. And here now we can use again our detail UI state. And here basically we want to use not. Okay, so here we can just call our detail view model. And we want to call the on not change, and basically we can just pass in here it. And also here we can provide a label. And here basically you can just pass in a modifier. So we have defined outside of our column these text fields, so we can just copy them. And we want to define them below the lazy column, the lazy row. And here we want to define our weight, and we want to make this 1F. And also we want to provide here a padding of 8 dp. So we are providing here weight. We want this outline text field to occupy the space which is going to be left by other items. Okay, now let's write here a preview function that is going to help us to preview this. And here we want to show system UI. And here we can call our node theme and basically pass in our detail screen here. And we can just pass in null here. And here we want to pass in empty for our text field. Now let's try to preview what we have. Okay, so everything is looking good here. As you can see, the UI is as expected. So now let's finish up the other parts and hook up everything inside our application. Okay, now so we can just close all other tabs. And here we want now to focus inside our home. And here we can just create a new routing class or file. And here we want to create a home view model. Okay, so now we can create here a data class. And we can call this home UI state. And here we want to display our nodes list. And this is going to use our resource object. And here we can just name this resource.loading. And also we want to get the not added, not deleted status. And this is just going to be a Boolean value. And for the first time, we're going to make it false. Okay, now let's create here our home UI state. And we can use a mutable state of, and here we call our home UI state. Okay, so now here we can just create our variables. So the first thing we want to get the user. And we can just call here repository. Okay, so also here we want to modify this user because we have defined inside here our storage repository this user as a variable. So this variable is going to be initialized only once. So we must make this to be a function. And this is just going to be returning a user. And also we can just come here inside our detail view model. And we have to modify this. Okay, so let's jump back inside here our user repository, our home view model. And for now here also we can define another variable. We can define this as user. And we can just call here repository.hasUser. And here we can use our user ID. And here we can just define our get, and we want to use the repository.getUserID. Okay, so now here we want to load our nodes. So we can create a function that is going to load nodes. Okay, so now we want to check if the user is logged in. So we can just load the data. So we can call here hasUser. And for this case here, we can just create another function, a private function that is going to help us to load this data. And we can call this getUserNodes. And here we have to obtain the user ID. And now here we have to use a view model scope. And we want to launch this CRUD scope. Okay, so now here we can use our repository and we want to get the user nodes. And here basically we have to pass in the user ID. And also we want to collect this. And here now we can just modify our home UI state. And here we can just provide our node list. And basically now we can just easily obtain by using it here. And now we can just easily call here our get user node. And here we have to provide the user ID. So we can just pass in here our user ID. And also here we have to check if the user ID is not blank. And else if this is the case here, now we want to display an error that the user is not logged in. So we can just call here our home UI state. And here we can define a throwable and we can create here a new throwable. and we can just write here a message. Okay, now let's add another function here, which is going to help us to delete the user node. So we can just create here a function, and we want to call this delete node. And here basically we will have to obtain the node ID. And here we can just call our repository, and we want to call delete node. And here basically we can just pass in the node ID. And here we have a callback, so we can just modify our home UI state. And we can just modify here our deleted status and pass in it here. Okay, so also here we have to add a function that is going to help us to sign out. So we can just call this sign out. And also here we can just use repository.signout. So we have not created this method which is going to help us to sign out. So we can just navigate inside here our storage repository. And here we can just create a function that is going to help us to sign out. And we can use our Firebase Auth.signout. And this is just going to sign us out. And here we can just call sign out. Okay, so now let's deal with our home screen here and finish to set it up. Okay, now here let's pass in several parameters first. So here we want to pass in our home view model, and this could be nullable. And also here we want to define our on not click. And here basically we are going to pass in the ID. And this is going to return a unit. And also we want to navigate to the detail page. And here we want to navigate to the login page if the user clicks sign out. And here we can just obtain our home UI state. Okay, now let's create here a little space first. And here we're just going to create several variables. So we want first to open the dialog. So we can just call this open dialog. And we can use a remember function. And also here we want to obtain the selected node. So we can just call this selected node. And this can be nullable. So we are going to use also a remember function again. And we are going to use a mutable state of null. Also, we can create here a scope. So we want to launch our coroutine. So we can just call this scope. And we call remember coroutine scope. And also here we want to obtain the scaffold state. And call remember scaffold state. Okay, now here let's create a scaffold. And we can pass in here the scaffold state. Okay, now let's add here a floating action button. And here we can just pass in the icon. And we want just to pass in using these icons here, and we can use a default. And also here we want to react to the on click, and we want to navigate to the detail page when this floating action button is going to be clicked. So navigate to detail page, and we can just invoke this function here. Okay, now let's add here a top bar. And here we can basically add a top up bar. And here we can just pass in the navigation icon. And we can pass in here the title. Okay, so here in the navigation icon, we want to display an icon button. And here we can just use the icons. Okay, so here we're going to use this exit to app. And here the on click, we want to sign out. So we can use our home view model. And we want to navigate to the login page. So we can call here navigate to login page and invoke this. And here on the part of the title, we can just pass in a text. Okay, so here we can just pass in the padding. Okay, so now we can create here a column. And we can basically pass in here a modifier. Okay, so we want to use here a when statement because we're going to receive the list. So we can use here our home UI state. Okay, so now we want to check here if this is going to be is loading. And if this is the case, then we want to show a circular progress bar. And here basically we can just pass in a modifier. And we want to fill the max size. And we want to call here wrap content size. And then we want to align this to the center. So we are filling up here the whole size. So we don't want this to follow the column principles. So we are going to make it to center it horizontally and vertically. And now here we can check if is resource success. And here we can just add an else blank. And we can use here our home UI state. And we want to obtain the not list. And we can pass in here the color and we can make this to be red. Okay, now let's deal here with the success part. Okay, so now here we want to display the notes inside an item. So we can just come below this. And we can create another composable. And here we want to call this not item. And here now we can just pass in notes. And we want to pass in the on long click. So we want to delete an item when we perform a long click. And also we have the on click, which is going to help us to navigate when we click a not item. And here we can just create a card and pass in a modifier. And we can just create here a modifier. And we want to use combined click here. And we can just call here the on click. And we want to use the on long click. And we have to invoke this function also. And we have to add in the experimental API here. And here we can just add a padding of 8 dp. And we can set the background color of this. So we can just use utils. And now we want to use the selected color. So we can just use here our note. And we can use our color index to get the selected color. Okay, now let's create here a column. And we want to display here a text. And we can just use here our notes. And we want to select here our title. And also here we want to provide a style. And we can just use here a material theme. And we want to use header 6 because this is just going to be a title. And we want to change also the font weight. And we want to make this to be bold. And we want to make this to occupy a max line. And only to occupy one line. And in case if there are overflows, so we want to clip. And also here we can just pass in a modifier. And we want to pass in a padding of 4 dp. And now let's create here a spacer. And we want to specify a spacer of 4 dp. And now here we want to create another text, but we want to decrease its opacity. So we can just use the compositional local provider. And here basically now we can just use the local content alpha. And this is just going to give us we want to decrease the opacity. So we can just use this content alpha. Now let's keep this in a new line. And we want to use this disabled because it's going to decrease the opacity, giving us a gray effect. And for this case here, now we can just create our text. And here basically we can just provide our style. Now we want to provide a material theme, and we can just use here body 1. And we can put this in a new line. And here we want to define the overflow. And here we want to define text ellipse. And we can define here a modifier padding of 4 dp. And we want to define the max line. And here we can just provide 4 lines. So we don't want more than 4 lines here. And here we can just add another spacer of 4 dp. Okay, so also again, we want to copy this. And instead here we want to create a date, and we can just easily change here the alignment, and we want to align this to the end. So we can just add here an align, and we want to make the alignment.end. Okay, so here we want to create another function that is going to help us to format the date. So let's create here a private function, and we want to call this format date. And here we want to receive the timestamp. And this is just going to return a string. And here we can just create a simple date format. And here we want to use this format here. And here we can just use locale.getDefault. And for this case here, now we want to return. And we can call here our timestamp.toDate so that we can just format this. And now let's just navigate back inside our CRUD. And here we can just call format date. And here now we use our node and we obtain our timestamp. And for this case here, I think we have finished to create our UI. So now let's create here below this a preview function. And here we can just call our home. And here we can basically pass in null. Okay, so now let's finish up to set our UI. So you can just navigate here back to our on success item. Okay, so let's create here a lazy vertical grid. And here now we can just provide the cells. So we can just call this grid cells. And we want to use this fixed. And here we're just going to define the amount of what we want. And this is just experimental because I'm using a lower version of Compose, but it is just in a stable mode. And here we want to pass in the content padding. So here we can just pass in the padding values, and we want a content padding of 16 dp. We have to use here the items, which has a list here. And here we can just define our not. Okay, now let's define our not item. Okay, so now we want to react when we perform the on long click. And what we want to do here, we can just invoke here. So we want to open the dialog. So we can just set up here, open dialog. And we can make this to be true. And also we want to get the selected not. And we can just pass in here the not. So we are going to create this dialog in a moment. So for now, let's also invoke here the on not click. And we can just pass in the ID here. So we can just use here the not. And we want to pass in the document ID, which is just going to be the not ID. Okay, so I think now we have finished to set up a UI. So we want to check if the user is actually logged in, and if not, we want them to be navigated to the login page. So now we can just collapse everything here. And now below this, we can just create here a launch defect. And here now we can just use our home view model. And we want to check if has user. So we can just check here. We can use here the home view model. And we want to check if has user and is actually false. So if this is actually false, then we know that the user is not logged in. So what we can do here, we can just call here our nav to login page, and we want to invoke it here. Okay, so now here we have finished to create our home UI. So let's navigate here inside our navigation, and now we can just finish up and hook everything up. Okay, so right now here we are just using a single navigation graph. And as you can see here, we have a lot of composables and we cannot just nest them inside here. So we are going to use a nested navigation, which is just easy to implement. And for now here, we can just delete this. And what we want to do here is to add another enum class. And here we are just going to call this nested navigation, nested routes. And here now we have our home, which is going to be our main. We have our login route here, sorry. Okay, so now we can just easily copy everything here inside our authentication. And we can just create here an extension function. And we want to use here the nav graph builder. And we want to call this auth graph. And here we want to pass in the nav controller. And also we want to pass in here the login view model. And now we can just pass in this. Now we have first to call here the navigation. So here we have to specify the start destination. So we can just specify here our start destination. And here basically now we can just using our login. And we want to use this sign in and .9. And we have to specify here the route. So this is just going to define these routes of this navigation graph. And here now we can just use our nested routes. And for that case here now we have the navigation builder here. So we can just use here our composables which we have been defining here. Okay, so instead here of navigating directly to the home route, so we can just use here the nested navigation. So we can just call here the nested routes, and we want to use the main.name. So this one is going to define the home route and the detail route. So directly we are just going to navigate to this route here. And also we can just copy this. And also we want to use it when we are going to. So also here inside our sign up route, we want to change this to navigate to this route here. Okay, now we can just jump inside here our nav host. And for now here we can just call here our auth graph, and we want to pass in here the nav controller and the login view model. And for now let's create here another extension function. So we can just call here our nav graph build again, and we want to call this home graph. So here we want to pass in the nav controller, and also we want to pass in here the detail view model and also the home view model. Okay, so here we can just define our navigation, and this is just going to define the start destination. And for case here inside this home route, we want to have our first destination, which is just going to be the home. So we can just call here the home routes. So this is just going to be our start destination, and we can just define the route. And here we have to use the nested routes, and we want to use this main.name. So whenever we navigate to this route here, the start destination is going to be the home page. And for that case here inside, we can just add the composables. So we can just create here a composable, and we want to define the route here. And this is just going to be our home route. Okay, now let's define here our home composable. Okay, and here we want to define our home view model. And inside here, the on not click, we want to define the not ID. Okay, so here we want to navigate to the details screen, but we are going to have to pass the not ID. So we can just create here a nav controller, and we want to navigate to the details screen. So we are just going to create here our details screen composable right now here. But first we want to navigate this. So we can just use here the home routes. And in order to pass the ID here, we are just going to pass in a parameter. So this is just how Jetpack Compose navigation works. So here we can just pass in the parameter which we want, which is just going to be the ID. And again, here we are just going to call this not ID. And we want to call here launch single top and make this to be true. So we don't want to have multiple instances of this launching. So we only want a single item to be there. Okay, and here we want to navigate to the detail page. And for now, here we can just call here our nav controller, and we can call just navigate. And here we want to pass in the home route. So as you can see here, we are using an optional argument passing here because we are just for example, here when we are going to click the floating action button, we don't have the ID, so we are just passing in here the route, and instead here we are passing the route and the ID. Okay, so here we want to click when we want to navigate back to the login page. So the user is either clicking the sign out button, so we have to navigate back to our login page. So we can just call here our nav controller, and we want to navigate, so we can just use here our nested routes, and we want to directly go to our login page, and the login page knows what it can do. And here basically now when we navigate, we want to launch a single top, and we can make this to be true, and we want to pop up too, so we don't want to include anything, so we're just passing in here 0, so everything in the back stack is going to be removed, and we want to make this inclusive, including this screen here, so we are just going to remove. And for that case, I think we have finished to create here our navigation inside our. Okay, now let's create here our detail composable. So we can just call this composable. So here we want to pass in the route, so we can just call here our route. And here we have to specify the template, and for our template here we want to pass in the ID, and you have to specify as how I'm writing here, otherwise you are just going to get an error when you are navigating. And we have to pass in here the argument parameter, and here we can just use a list of, and we want to use the nav arguments. And here we have to specify the name, and for the case here we have already specified the name of the ID, and this is just going to be here the same name. Okay, so here we have now our parameters, so we can just define here a type, and for our case this is just going to be a string type, and we want to define the default value. And for the case here, we want to define a default value of an empty string. So as you can see here, we are just using this optional argument because sometimes we don't have to pass in the argument. So we have to define the default value, which is just going to be an empty string for that case. Okay, now here we can just open up our brackets, and here we have to rename this to entry. Okay, now we can just call here our detail screen. And here basically we can just pass in our detail view model. And the ID here we can just easily obtain it from the entry. And we want to get the string, and here we can just pass in the ID, and we want this to be as a string. Okay, so we want when this back button is going to be clicked, so we want to navigate back to where we were, so we can just call this navcontroller.navigate up, and this one is going to help us to navigate back to where we were. Okay, now I think we have finished to create here our home graph, so we can just navigate back here inside our nav host, and we can just pass in here our home graph, and here we have to pass in the nav controller, and we have to pass in here the detail view model and the home view model. So we can just create here detail view model and home view model. And for this case here, now we can just pass in here our detail view model and the home view model. Okay, so as you can see here now, our nav host is looking pretty good, and this is just the good use of nested navigation. So now let's jump inside here our main activity and finish up everything. Okay, now here we want to obtain other view models, so we can just define here the home view model. And instead here we can just call our home view model. And here we want to get the detail view model. And here we can just call detail view model. And for that case here, we can just pass in our detail. So I think everything is looking good. Now let's try to run our application and see the changes we have made. Okay, so when we launch our application, we are getting this error here. We cannot create an instance of the home view model. So let's jump inside here, our home view model. And as you can see here, we are instantiating here the repository, but we are not going to initialize it. So here we have to initialize our storage repository. And also we can just jump inside here, our detail view model, and check it. Also here we are not instantiating this, so we can just call this detail. We have to call here the storage repository. And now let's try to rerun again and see the changes. Also, we are getting another error here that navigation destination sign in is not a direct child of this nav graph. So if you navigate here inside our navigation, so you can just come here inside our start destination. We are just defining here the login route sign in to be the starting destination. So for our case here, we can just define the start destination by using these nested routes, which we have defined here. So we can just change this. And we want to use here the nested routes. And we want to use this main.name here instead of using the sign in as our destination. Now let's try to rerun again and see. Okay, so our application has launched successfully. However, we are having here a spinning bar. And also when we navigate here, we can just easily type in our data. And we can just change here our colors as usual. And here we are just having a update icon, and we want this to be a check mark because we're just creating this, and we're going to fix this right now here. And when we navigate back here, we are still getting a spinning bar, and this is just because we forgot to actually implement a method that is going to fetch the data to the server. So we can just jump inside here, our home, and we want to create here a launched effect. And here we are going to pass in unit because we want to execute this block of code only once. And for now here we can just call here our home view model. And we want to actually load the nodes. And then we can just jump directly to our detail screen here. So you can just find it here, the detail screen. And we want to fix this. So when we navigate here in the icons, we want to change here is not the form. So we want to change this is not. When the node ID is going to be blank, we are going to have a check mark. And if not, then we are going to have the update icon. And for that case, we're going to fix this issue. And also we want to hide this floating action button if the user is actually not typing anything inside our edit text. So we can add here an animated visibility. And directly here now we can just check is forms not blank. And then we can just paste this. And here we want to add this to opt-in for experimental APIs. And now when we run our application, we are going to get an error because we want to also include a compound query. So let's try to run our application and see. Okay, so when you run the application and navigate to the logcat here, you can see we are getting this message here. So the query requires an index. So we are required to create a compound query because we are having two fields which we are editing. And here we can just click this link here and we can easily create this. Okay, so the console has detected the fields which we want to create a compound query for. So for now, we can just click this create index here and it's going to build this. And as you can see here, it's just building. Okay, so now our query is enabled, so we can just jump inside our application and now start to see how we can add and remove data. Okay, so now we're just getting here a loading animation. And now we can try here first to log out. and you can just try to sign in or create a new account. So you can just try here abd@gmail, and we can just sign in here, and we have a successful login here. Now let's try here to create a new item, and as you can see here, our floating action button is hidden. And for now here, we can just create our title 1 2 3 and write here our notes 1 2 3. Now let's try to change here color, and now let's try to save here our item, and we have the added note successfully, and we can just navigate to the home screen, and here we have our title. And now let's try to click this, and we want to edit this color here and also change this. And now let's try to update our item, and our note is updated successfully, and then we can be navigated back to our home screen. Now let's try to add another item here. And now when we long click here, we're just going to delete a note, and we get this. Now we have deleted the note successfully. So guys, let's end up here. So if you have any question, please let me know in the comment section below. And if you find this video helpful, please don't forget to provide a like and subscribe for more videos. So see you in the next video. Bye bye for now.